War. War never changes. That's a great tagline, but what does it mean? The Sumerians never used atomic bombs or guided missiles. Everything about war has changed. Weapons, formations, tactics, the philosophy of how and why wars are waged. Even the very conception of what a soldier is has changed. War is a regular ship of Theseus. History abounds with distinct patterns and movements of when it all changes, from the advent of gunpowder to the professional standing army. In the Middle Ages, European combat was dominated by the knight, a heavily armored cavalry soldier equipped with lance and warhorse. But over the course of the 14th century, the cavalry soldier began to be replaced in importance by the unmounted infantrymen using pikes and other polearms in tight formation, the beginnings of a new infantry revolution. But that can't be the full story. After all, spears and tight formations were what the Greeks used with their hoplites to beat the Achaemenid Persians. So what changed in the 14th century, and why? Why war changes is just as important as what changes. What and why form the basis for understanding the changes in military history. What and why are long answers, but who, where, and when are much easier. It's the 11th of July, 1302, in Flanders, where a group of Flemish militia will become one of the first heralds of this new way of war. This is Battle of Golden Spurs. While the lavish lifestyle of medieval kings is not an unjustified stereotype, kings were often chronic bankrupts through the Middle Ages. One country that wasn't doing so great on the balance sheet was the Kingdom of France. France in 1300 had been waging wars regularly to consolidate royal power for over 15 years. This wouldn't be a uniquely French thing. One of the big struggles in the late Middle Ages was the transition from the feudal models of the Middle Ages to the centralized proto-national governments of the early modern period. While feudalism itself is a complicated governmental system, it boils down to a contract between a king and his subordinate, called the vassal. The vassal owed military service for a set period of time in exchange for land, called a fief, in a basic service-for-favor type of relationship. Originally, these lands reverted back to the crown at the death of the vassal, but over time, the vassals gained the automatic right to pass down their fiefdoms to their children, massively constraining the power of the king. Now, whenever the king wanted to show favor to a vassal, he had to take the land from someone else, and that never made anyone happy. All throughout the Middle Ages, but especially in the 14th century, kings and powerful vassals were fierce rivals for power. Tradition favored the vassal in their inherited domains, with power set by precedent stretching back since the early Middle Ages, about 600 or 700 years of precedent. That's as far away from the late Middle Ages then as we are to the late Middle Ages now. Not only that, but a new type of feudalism was emerging, what historian Charles Plummer called bastard feudalism. Bastard feudalism was a new type of service for favors, where minor lords would be recruited into the sphere of powerful vassals, who would provide service in exchange for the vassal representing said minor lords at the national level of politics. This created a cultural identity of lords viewing themselves not as servants of the king, but servants of these powerful vassals, which meant kings were often outnumbered and royal courts were plagued with factionalism. To counter this, kings often relied on gaining more direct holdings in their domain through centralization. Direct administration came with a rise in tax revenue, which could fund larger retinues and a bureaucracy that could counter that of these overmighty vassals. These kings would rely on their civil servants as a rival group of power against the aristocracy and manage the ever-increasing complexity of their royal holdings. This would happen at scattered points throughout Europe and usually would come with a very strong, very vigorous king. For France, that would come at the end of the 13th century. As the late Middle Ages began, so too did the French monarchy change into this new evolution of government. King Philip IV would be 17 years old in 1285 when he ascended the French throne. Famed for his handsome features, he was named in court as Philip the Fair. He had another name, the Roi de Fer, the Iron King, and he would be called that for his unceasing desire to establish an uncontested monarchy. Philip fought the aristocracy and the clergy for greater centralization of the French monarchy. Over the course of his reign, he would significantly expand royal holdings in central and eastern France, from Poitou to Champagne, install princes in Naples and Hungary, create the Avignon papacy, expel the Jewish population, and annihilate the Knights Templar. A lot of these would happen after the Battle of the Golden Spurs, but it serves to demonstrate the character of this aggressive, reform-minded king. With the royal treasury running low from his efforts, though, Philip turned his eyes to the northeastern part of his kingdom, what's called Belgium now, but in the 14th century was called the County of Flanders. Flanders had always been a part of France since the middle of the 9th century, but logistical shortcomings and the difficulty of pre-modern communications meant Flanders operated more or less as an independent county. In the 14th century, the area of Flanders was incredibly wealthy. Situated between the Kingdom of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, the Flemish merchants grew wealthy on the English wool trade and the large textile industry. This turned Flanders into an economic juggernaut, much like the trade republics of Venice and Genoa on the Mediterranean. The coffers of Flanders were bursting, and Philip saw in Flanders the solution to his monetary woes. The higher taxes were, unsurprisingly, not very popular in Flanders, either with the lower classes or the rural Flemish aristocracy. The Count of Flanders, Guy of Dampierre, sought an alliance with the English king Edward I, better known as Edward Longshanks, leveraging that lucrative trade relationship between Flanders and England. But the English had troubles of their own, and Edward had to call off his campaign to face the Scots. Philip used that as a pretext to arrest Count Guy and formally incorporate Flanders as a direct royal holding. By 1300, Philip left Flanders after making what administrative changes to secure his control of the province that he saw fit. Now it should be said that the people of the cities of Flanders didn't care much for Count Guy. Most of the aristocracy were rural landholders who primarily made their money off of farming. The cities, however, had wealthy patricians and tradesmen allied into powerful guilds. I've mentioned before that kings and vassal nobles were often at odds during the Middle Ages, but that was only one of the many class-based conflicts leading into the Renaissance. The other big one is the clash between the rising middle class and the trade guilds with the old nobility. These newly wealthy patricians were often not afforded the same rights and privileges as the old money aristocracy. This caused much conflict between burghers and nobles, especially as rents, the primary income of feudal nobles, were fixed, and thus they could not keep up with rising inflation. This led to plenty of nobles in genteel poverty, and nouveau riche merchants and bankers, backed by wealthy and influential trade guilds, kept out of the halls of power. The aristocracy looked down the merchants as being in trade, but this new class of people were making a positive fortune through being in trade. Conflict was bound to arise between the eroding power of the nobility and the rising fortunes of the urban elite. The urban elites demanded a seat at the table of power, and the nobility refused to cede what authorities they had, stating simply that money couldn't buy privileges. This issue of class would be a bone of contention across Europe, but in Flanders in the 1300s, it was a concern driving the population to war. However much the urbanites disliked Count Guy and the rest of the rural Flemish nobility, direct French control was much worse. Count Jacques de Châtillon was appointed the leader of Flanders, and he was a French noble and disdained the lower classes and the urban rich. Not only was he openly contemptuous towards the urbanites of Flanders and the lower classes, but he was a foreign overlord. The lower classes chafed under the high taxes and smoldered at Châtillon's open contempt of them, as well as his ineffective governments. Châtillon was used to governing a rural fief, not an urban environment whose primary income was trade and industry. It would take 2 years, but the discontent and unrest would reach a breaking point. In 1302, the lower classes of the Flemish town of Bruges finally took action. Bruges had a lucrative trade monopoly on English wool, but King Edward Longshanks and the guilds had cut a personal deal between themselves for new shipments. This sidelined the aristocracy entirely. Previously, the nobles had been the one to make the deals with the king and receive their own cut, but now the aristocracy was smoldering as what they saw as the denial of their traditional rights and percentages of the fortune of the valuable textile trade. The guildsmen saw it as cutting out a completely worthless middleman. As you can see, this conflict is almost a microcosm of the conflict between the urban tradesmen and the rural aristocracy in a single moment. The nobles wrote to King Philip, asking him to protect their trade monopoly. King Philip responded by installing a French garrison in Bruges, much to the protest and anger of the natives. These French soldiers were often harsh towards the families of the people who protested against their actions or simply their presence within the city. Now, in the modern day, this seems like a strange concept, but garrison forces were quartered in the homes of the citizenry if the barracks were deemed insufficient. Their upkeep was taken care of by the citizens as well. As you might imagine, being forced to feed and house a garrison force did not sit well with many people, but particularly those of the lower class. They were closely supervised and often squeezed for extra coin. On the 18th of May, enough was enough. An armed group of lower-class men, led by the butcher, Jan Bredel, and the weaver, Peter de Koninck, stormed the houses where the French were garrisoned and slaughtered them, beginning what would go down in history as the Massacre of Rouge, named after the matin bells that signaled the start. The simpler name is the Bruges Massacre. Now, this was done through an old concept called the shibboleth, and such a concept dates back to biblical times. The name itself comes from the Bible, where a distinction in the pronunciation of the Hebrew letter Shin distinguished a Hebrew from an Ephraimite. How shibboleths work is using a challenge phrase with letters that either do not exist in a certain language or are pronounced in a notably distinct fashion. This doesn't always have to be the case, though. This is done throughout history. Even today, irregular forces typically use litmus tests, such as the shibboleth, to identify nationalities or religions of people as a precursor to a slaughter. In the Bruges Massacre, the legend suggests that the word used was Schild en Vriend, which means shield and friend. The Flemish people would pronounce the word vriend with a voiced V sound, while the French would use a voiceless F sound, saying friend. Those who answered in the French style would be butchered on the spot, still in their nightshirts. Some linguists who have studied this have their doubts in the legend. They suggest that instead, the phrase was des Gildenvriend, which means the guild's friend. Even others suggest that multiple phrases were used, and judgment was passed based on the accent rather than the pronunciation of the singular word friend. Now, legends are often wrong or mistold, but one of the important things to know about studying history is that even the lies and the legends have meaning. What is important is that if you were deemed French, you were killed. The number of Frenchmen killed in the city is unknown, but it's estimated to be around 2,000. One of the Frenchmen who did escape, though, was Jacques de Châtillon. The news of this action spread like wildfire, and the cities of Flanders rushed to join the Bruges Rebellion, save for the city of Ghent, which declared neutrality. Even though it was neutral, that did not stop several hundred volunteers from leaving the city to come and join. Much of the rural Flemish aristocracy sided with the French, frightened by what they saw as an uprising of the lower classes, and fearing that they could be deposed from their lofty perches or simply killed by association. The Flemish rebellion was commanded by a collection of characters that perfectly encapsulated the myriad parts. The organizers of the Bruges Matin, Peter de Koninck and Jan Bredel, formed an essential part of leadership. The wealthy patricians and wool merchants like Jan Borluut also provided men and money for the rebellion. There were even a few nobles, like William of Ulick and Guy of Namur, who were resistant to French rule and interference in their previous de facto independence. They asserted a spirit of almost proto-Flemish nationalism, even though nations really didn't exist in the 1300s. This highly spirited army overwhelmed French garrisons and attempted to lay siege to the town of Cotteret on the Liège River. The French weren't going to stand for this, and King Philip organized a punitive expedition to put down the Flemish rebellion with extreme prejudice. To this, he named the Count of Artois, Robert II, to lead. Robert II was a natural choice, as he had previously subdued a Flemish revolt 5 years before, and he understood the terrain of Flanders. At the head of a force of about 8,000 strong, Count Robert marched to Flanders. The core of his force was the traditional feudal knight, the well-armed and well-armored heavy cavalry equipped with lance, sword, and a chainmail hauberk with partial plate armor. The iconic full-plate armor was still about a century away, but the short-sleeved chainmail hauberk of the High Middle Ages had been improved upon significantly. It was longer, extending to the wrist and past the knee, and it was supplemented with plates of metal armor, helping to protect against piercing arrows and long, slashing cuts with swords. The mail coif of earlier eras had an iron skull cap on top, called a cervelier, for added protection. The signature mail and plate armor had extraordinary protective power for the time frame. These knights rode horses and were tremendously mobile and effective. This mobility and their armor made them the tanks of medieval warfare. The mass of knights charging with their lances was incredibly powerful and demoralizing to their opponents, especially unmounted infantry. The mass and speed of mounted horsemen tore through battle lines, often causing a rout simply by the sheer fear of their charge. Supplementing this heavy mobile shock troop was a force of infantry, primarily crossbowmen and spearmen. While the cavalry was often used to break up lines, infantry had a vital part to play on the medieval battlefield. They engaged and pinned enemy forces, and they were cheaper to equip and maintain than a full knight. They were also much more effective on difficult terrain where heavy man and horse could not move effectively, such as swamps, hills, and narrow mountain passes. Equally as important as the military power of the knight was the class structure of medieval Europe. Knights were not simply heavy cavalry. They were a caste of elite soldiers whose model of government, feudalism, supported them at the top of the food chain. European nobility was a hereditary martial aristocracy, using symbols, politics, and force in equal measure to stay at the top of the social food chain. The class system was seen as divinely ordained, and martial service was heavily prized. Heroic tales of chivalry showcased that these knights were valorous in the face of the enemy. Chivalry was an unwritten code and ethos that defined the military aristocracy, a blending of Roman philosophy with Franco-German traditions and Catholic ethics that grew in the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the rise of Charlemagne. This class structure was under threat in the late Middle Ages, by the cities, by the wealthy urban elite, and by a more active, more responsive peasantry. The upper classes often feared and brutally suppressed any activity of the lower classes. In contrast to the French knights, the Flemish militia was almost entirely infantry, and almost entirely made up of members of the middle and lower classes, save for the few Flemish nobility that sided with them. Much like the infantry from across the field, the militia was equipped with a chainmail hauberk and helmet, and were armed with a mix of bows and crossbows, along with spears, pikes, and the signature Dutch weapon, the Hodendog. The Hodendog is deeply tied up with the Franco-Flemish War, and this battle in particular. Even the name is a reference to Bruges, when the Flemish militia slaughtered the French in the early morning. It was a stout, heavy, 5-foot club, topped with a sharpened steel spike, and it is as simple as it is brutally effective. The spike gives it good range to menace an armed opponent and keep them at bay. The heavy body can deliver a solid blow even through thick armor, and it can be gripped easily in the middle to finish off a downed opponent with a solid spike thrust through the helmet, in the face, or between segments in armor. These militia knew how to use their equipment, as many of them doubled in the town guard, and they prided themselves in their readiness. The guilds took care of organization, using their own hierarchies as a military chain of command and grouping men together in cohesive units. While these men were not professional soldiers, they had training and morale, and that would be critical in the battle to come. Now, training and morale are good to have on your side, but the Flemish decided that it was better to prepare for the battle as well. While laying siege to Courtrai, they prepared the battlefield to deal with the expected French attack. Flanders has heavy rainfall and low elevation, and this leads to it having very muddy terrain. Armies throughout history have bogged into the mud of Flanders. British and German forces even in the 20th century will be stymied by the mud of Flanders, and the armies of Robert of Artois would suffer in that same mire, made worse by the fact that the Flemish took up position near two streams, where the soil would be damp and soft. To supplement their position, the Flemish militia dug pits and trenches and covered them with brush or filled them with water, a classic, easy-to-craft defense against cavalry. They drew their lines in an arc to blunt the classic flying wedge of the French knights. With their pikes and hudenda, the Flemish militia crafted a thicket of sharp points, and there they waited. The few cavalry and the Zeelander nobility formed a reserve behind that arc, ready to deploy when they were needed. When Count Robert first saw these formidable defenses, he ordered that servants place wood to make the terrain easier to navigate in an early form of combat engineering. This didn't work, however. The Flemish attacked the fieldworks and the servants as they were being laid down. Robert then ordered a cautious move forward, using a slow advance with his infantry, who would carefully negotiate the trenches and pits laid by the Flemish forces. As was typical for most medieval battles, archers in loose formation fired at each other, attempting to clear them from the field. The French crossbowmen, having better quality shields and attendants, were able to force the Flemish archers to withdraw behind their lines, giving them a marked advantage as the French infantry advanced slowly and carefully toward the Flemish lines. Now, this damp and muddy battlefield forms a great image in the mind of a medieval footman. Just picture it. It's humid and uncomfortable thanks to the summer temperatures combined with the wet Flemish climate, and you have to march in tight, constraining mail on muddy, heavy terrain crisscrossed with snares and trenches. Your feet can barely catch anything in the muck, and you stumble and slither on that marshy ground, slowly walking towards the people with weapons pointed at you, ready to cut you down. The strain on the Flemish militia is enormous. Their backs are to a river. The French cavalry could easily run them down if they try to flee. Mercy is going to be non-existent given what happened at Bruges, and minute by minute, the French infantry march closer and closer and closer. Their armor is better, their weapons are better, and your traps are not as useful as you were hoping. Your archers have been driven back. All you can do is stand there and wait. Once the French infantry crossed the marshy ground, they attacked the Flemish lines. Spears and pikes pressed against each other, but the French, with their excellent equipment and training with supporting fire from the crossbowmen, proved more than a match for the Flemish militia, pushing them back. While the French were pushing, they were not breaking the battle lines. The Flemish were able to tighten the ranks, keeping their rows together, and preventing a collapse that could have broken open the Flemish battle line and inflicted a catastrophic defeat. Count Robert had the battle well in hand, even if it was taking much longer than he would wish. But this issue of class started to arise again. The French knights were nervous that the infantry, made up of men that were not part of the landed gentry, would win the battle by themselves. This went against the noble obligation of winning the battlefield. And taking it a bit more cynically, the French knights crushing these upstart peasant militias would be seen as a potent symbol to other peasants in case they got too uppity. The knights constantly entreated Count Robert to deploy the cavalry to run roughshod all over this Flemish militia. Eventually, Count Robert agreed and commanded his infantry to withdraw. His knights would launch the final decisive charge, with knights charging on the left and the right wings. This withdrawal gave the Flemish infantry time to prepare. Seeing the knights massing, the Flemish shored up their lines and tightened their ranks, putting the Huttendog and pikes forward to meet the charge. On open ground, this final charge would have been the nail in the coffin for the rebels. The heavy cavalry would charge in with maximum force. But the problem is that these knights don't have the ability to charge at maximum force. The marshy terrain, the field works, all of these things were hampering the French ability to deliver a powerful charge. Even worse, the French knights, overconfident in their victory, did not advance in tight a formation as they were trained to do. This had a negative effect on their ability to deliver the powerful punch that they were famous for. The more flexible and lightly armored Flemish militia were able to better navigate the difficult terrain, deflect the momentum of the French charge, and push them back into the marshy terrain, where their mounts foundered and they were much easier to attack. Upon seeing this, the French made two desperate charges. The French garrison at Courtrai Castle sallied forth, but Flemish captains, savvy to a possible attack launched to their rear, left behind a contingent of Ypres militia to guard the bridge from Courtrai at the Flemish rear. Using their long pikes, they held the bridge and prevented a sudden attack on the rear, creating a panic and diverting attention from repulsing the French cavalry. Count Robert, leading the finest French knights on the field, charged the center, hoping to split the Flemish line in two and cause a mass panic. Now this shock tactic was very common for a medieval knight. They would charge in a wedge and try to split a line in two. When that happened, the knights could wheel upon their mounts and attack two newly exposed flanks, collapsing those units. Should those units rout, an entire line could fear a general collapse and completely flee the battlefield, even on the cusp of victory. Medieval warfare was full of these routes. While medieval battles could and were notoriously bloody, most casualties were done in the pursuit of a broken foe. When a formation broke, often mass numbers broke because those units were depending upon that singular formation to cover their weak spots. A suddenly exposed flank would become a weakness, and a unit that found itself unsupported would break before it could be attacked at that weak spot. Any retreat would become a mass rout, as the units would fear that they would be surrounded, exposed, and killed, and it would turn into a mad dash to get away from the battlefield until the pursuit units elected either to not pursue or to pursue other targets, usually the ones that were slower to get away. If the French knights could see their commander breaking the Flemish center, they could rally, and the Flemish themselves could panic, seeing their strong line split in one ferocious charge. Unlike the other French knights, Count Robert's charge was brilliantly successful, smashing the Flemish center like bowling pins. But the Zealand Reserve, kept in waiting the entire time, countercharged to pin Robert's forces before he could turn on the flanks and roll down both lines. The Flemish troops on the front peeled off any who could be spared to move back towards Robert, now isolated, before his mounted troops could retreat. In an instant, Robert's force had gone from a massively successful shock attack to completely surrounded on all sides by Flemish infantry. The knights, mired in the muddy soil, couldn't get enough momentum to hew their way out, and the command unit was killed, the standard of Artois falling into the swamp. The Flemish would tell later that Count Robert begged for his life, with the Flemish units responding that they didn't speak French. This legend is probably not true, but as I've said, even the legends and lies have meaning. What certainly was true was that Robert was killed, and this broke the spirit of the French army. This also galvanized the Flemish, who ordered a general charge with all ranks forward. The knights, in dire straits, were surrounded and killed. The infantry, who were on the other side because they had withdrawn earlier, saw their commander die and quit the field, pursued by the Flemish for a full day of almost 6 kilometers. The knights were denied ransoms and executed, with the golden spurs taken as trophies from their bodies and hung up in the church of Our Lady. This is where the battle would get its name. Among the dead would be Robert of Artois, the Constable of France, Philip's chief advisor, and the deeply despised Jacques de Chatillon. The Flemish would take the castle of Courtrai and replace Ghent's neutral patricians with a much more favorable government made up of guildsmen, particularly favoring those volunteers who had marched forward from Ghent and assisted them in Courtrai. The success of Courtrai would not last. 3 years later, the French would have the Flemish militia on their knees, inflicting a catastrophic defeat at Mons and Bavelet. The innovations, though, would far outlast the Franco-Flemish War. These ideas of infantry using polearms, using field works and terrain to their advantage to break the speed and mass of cavalry, of these tight formations used handling the shock of a sudden charge, these are innovations that would change the very face of warfare. When the Scots used their schiltrons at Bannockburn, they would have to tip their hats to the men of Flanders. When the English would use fieldworks in terrain to constrain the French cavalry at Crécy, again, the Flemish were the ones to thank. Cavalry would diminish in importance, though it would remain vital for pursuit and mobility, and nobles would often fight unmounted, all because of one afternoon in Flanders. But more than that, these tactics also heralded a social change. Well-trained militia using polearms became a new way of warfare, and a successful one provided the generals knew what they were doing. These new units were cheaper than the feudal knights of previous eras, and that meant that smaller political entities were being much more effective on the battlefield. Cities could win success on the battlefield where before only rural kingdoms with farming populations that support knights were the norm for the day. Warfare was no longer the province of the wealthy elite. Just as the Marian reforms opened the ranks of the Roman legionnaires to the landless masses, this was a significant change in the ability of the lower social classes to make their influence known both on the battlefield and off. Local peasant rebellions became much more capable of standing up against the aristocracy, and their ability to cause damage would give the aristocracy pause, even in victory. The engine of change was in motion, and the ignition spark was provided on a muddy field in Flanders, where a group of craftsmen faced the finest soldiers that France could muster, where their new ideas crushed the old way of thinking. If war never changed, there would be no reason to delve into it throughout history. One battle would be enough for everyone. But for everything that changes, there are deeper concepts behind them. Seeking victory, leading troops, knowing what to do and when to do it, these are ideas that generals and soldiers are always looking for in a never-ending race of strategy, tactics, technology, and leadership. This constantly moving system, where an advance becomes discovered, integrated, countered, and rendered obsolete in a complex ballet of thought and action, that never changes, and shall always remain integral when mankind looks to wage war. Thanks for listening.